All right. So I thought this chapter was pretty interesting. It gave a lot of good history. Um, so if you had my theories class, some of you online didn't. Hopefully you had a great theory teacher, but so we talked about where all the different schools of thought came from, and like we talked about them beginning in Vienna and then moving to New York and then moving to California. And I also brought up that a lot of theories that had to do with either diagnosis, schema, or uh, child development occurred in Paris. But we didn't cover those theories because they weren't really counseling theories. But they get into them in this chapter because of diagnosis. And they also talk about memory for witnesses, and I kind of have my own ideas about that as well. But so I'll talk about it when he brings them up. But so he brings up this example of one of the clients that he saw, um, remembered. He had repressed these memories, and but he remembered when he saw a headline that a priest was being tried for sexual abuse of children, and then he remembered when he was abused as a child by this same person, and he was almost ready to get all these benefits from the Air Force, and he had to leave, be discharged 10 days before he got his benefits. So, his symptomology was pretty severe for them to discharge him 10 days early, and that he couldn't just hang in there for 2 weeks. But, they there's a lot of things when you get into court cases with memory. So witnesses of crimes are often extremely unreliable, especially with identification of individuals if you did not know them before. So obviously, he was in this Catholic Church for years. He was around this priest for years. He knew exactly who it was. So it wasn't an issue with this client. But just last year, there's a pretty famous author, Alice Sebold, who wrote a book called The Lovely Bones about how she experienced a rape, and she had seen this person and then picked him out of a lineup, and he spent 16 years in jail, and then they disproved all the evidence. In fact, it was mainly her testimony. But so he was released, and it was a faulty identification. And there's a lot of write-up about that, but they've done all kinds of different studies about basically faulty memory. The other thing that was big, and they wrote a whole book about this, but it's really problems with using hypnosis in reconstructing repressed memories. And I always had doubts with this because, and it turned out to be correct, that if you are under hypnosis, then you are highly suggestible. And the thing is with if you're under hypnosis and you're highly suggestible, you're not only suggestible when somebody says act like a chicken, you know, if you're on stage and somebody hypnotizes you, but people want to please others. So if they ask a leading question, they will formulate an answer that will be positive. So, for instance, if somebody says, "Did you ever experience abuse as a child?" they want to say yes instead of no. So a lot of times, what were thought to be repressed memories from childhood were actually hypnotic fabrications. And this was proved over and over again. However, a lot of damage was done as a result of this faulty technique. Families were broken apart when no abuse was experienced. And accusations were made because of, you know, hypnosis not being used properly. So an appropriate hypnotic question would be, can you please tell me a time as a child where you experienced stress? Okay, so can you tell me a time of happiness as a child? Tell me a time when you felt safe. But you can't include something in the question that they may not have experienced, because that becomes a suggestion under hypnosis. So that's the problem. And you have all these people who learned hypnosis and used it incorrectly. And I honestly don't know why people didn't understand this when it was happening. But it caused a lot of problems. All right. So the interesting thing about this, so normal versus traumatic history and memories. So they looked at individuals who were part of a study. It was a Harvard study. They looked at students, but they followed them throughout their lives. The study was originally done before World War II, and they didn't anticipate them going into World War II, but it happened. And most of the participants joined the military, went overseas, and fought in World War II. So then they followed up after the war, and then later as they were older adults. And what they found that with the passage of time, events had been bleached of their intense horror. In contrast, those who had been traumatized and subsequently developed PTSD did not modify their accounts. Their memories were preserved essentially intact 45 years after the war ended. And that's because that experience froze in time. And that memory, you know, it's like their lives stopped at that moment. So there is a difference in how we perceive memories, even if they were clear. And there's a difference between basically a memory that results in an experience that results in post-traumatic stress disorder versus I don't know, maybe a crisis that they were able to be resilient and overcome. So a large part of this chapter talks about the history of basically understanding in the very beginning the process of trauma. And so it takes us to Paris and a hospital in Paris that is connected to the Sorbonne, and it's kind of a teaching hospital. But that's where a lot of famous psychiatrists practiced, and they came up with things like, so Dr. Tourette was there, and of course, you know, he discovered the diagnosis for Tourette's syndrome, and other famous individuals were there, but he begins talking about the concept of hysteria. So that's where we get the word hysterectomy, and it's because hysteria is kind of the word for womb. It's from Greek, and I know it sounds crazy, but when they would talk about females being hysteria, the original theory was that their womb was moving around their body and causing emotional reactions and distress, and fainting was often a big part of this. So, of course, we know that's crazy, and you know, of course, that's not it. But they started investigating this, and there's a guy, Jean-Martin Charcot, Pierre Janet, and Sigmund Freud, and they were all in Paris at the same time. Freud came there to listen to Charcot's lectures, and he actually translated them from French to German so that people could read his lectures in German in Vienna. And so they are all associated with the discovery that trauma is at the root of hysteria, particularly the trauma of childhood sexual abuse. And, you know, the interesting thing is that the more Freud looked into this, you know, most of his clients were fairly well-to-do females, and he found that many of them had been sexually abused because he was seeing them for hysteria. But this brought up all kinds of implications with well-to-do society, and even abuse by Freud's father when Freud was younger, when he looked at his own symptomology. And all of these discoveries kind of made Freud move away from the pursuit of this. And then World War I occurred, and his focus shifted to a different kind of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, but they didn't call it that at the time. And they realized that trauma or hysteria could be experienced by both males and females as a result of World War I. So it really is kind of interesting. And I just picked out a couple things that I thought was interesting. For me, the real hero of this story is Pierre Janet, who helped Charcot establish a research laboratory devoted to the study of hysteria at, I don't even know how to pronounce it, but Salpêtrière in 1889. That's the hospital, the teaching hospital in Paris, connected with the Sorbonne. In 1889, the same year the Eiffel Tower was being built, to put this in a perspective, Janet published the first book-length scientific account of traumatic stress, and you know, proposed that the root of what we now call PTSD was the experience of vehement emotions or intense emotional arousal, arousal due to trauma. He also coined the term dissociation, and as we read, it's still a part of the PTSD definition and diagnosis criteria today. And he saw this as splitting off an isolation of memory imprints that he saw in patients. So it's almost a breaking off of individuals' traumatic memories versus the other memories in their life. And so eventually, I think that they started trying to treat the individuals, the clients, patients that they were working with who were suffering from this trauma. And they were very present for them. And eventually, in the beginning, it was very difficult for them to share their stories because of dissociation. And it might take hours for them to give basic facts of the story. But throughout therapy, what they would call the talking cure, they would be able to eventually connect their emotional story with their factual story. Once they were able to do this, once they were able to not disassociate or dissociate, but to associate, to make the connection between the story, their emotions again, it seemed to bring about a shift in the symptomology. And, they would be able to, move forward in a more positive direction. And, Freud even claimed that the ultimate cause of hysteria is usually the seduction of a child by an adult. And then faced with his own evidence of an epidemic of abuse in the best families of Vienna, one he noted that would implicate his own father, he quickly began to retreat from this subject. So, I think that's pretty interesting that, here we see a connection between the Vienna School of Medicine and that school of thought and the Paris School of Thought. And out of Vienna, we have psychological theories that we use in therapy. Began with Freud and Jung and Adler, and then then in Paris we have the beginning of diagnosis and really the roots of the DSM and studying of trauma, hysteria, abuse, and then connecting those two schools of thought and beginning basically talk therapy or, therapy. So it's kind of a neat connection. It's an interesting historical chapter. And next, we're going to finish up basically the first half of the book with one more chapter. And then we're going to continue with basically what type of therapy, what types of methods do we use to help individuals who are suffering from trauma, abuse, things like that. So, all right, that's it for this evening's lectures.